Everybody, welcome back for another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have Bret Easton Ellis, author of everyone's ex-boyfriend's favorite novels like Less Than Zero or American Psycho, versus David Foster Wallace, author of Brief Interviews with Hideous Men and the postmodern masterpiece Infinite Jest, a novel whose brilliance has been gradually tarnished by that one guy you knew in college who carried a copy of Infinite Jest around with him wherever he went, while listening to the Smiths at full volume and probably wearing a beanie in the summer. And yes, of course that was me. Despite being contemporaries, David Foster Wallace and Bret Easton Ellis never actually met each other. But they're distinctly similar in a lot of ways. Particularly, both were considered sort of these literary wunderkinds or prodigies. Bret Easton Ellis published Less Than Zero when he was only 21 years old, and David Foster Wallace published his debut, The Broom of the System, when he was just 25. However, and as is often the case with these feuds, comparison breeds contempt. So this feud begins in 1993 when David Foster Wallace is giving an interview to the Review of Contemporary Fiction. And in that interview, he's discussing what he sees as a major problem in fiction at the time. And it's kind of a twofold problem. Now, one, if you've read Wallace, then you know his deep-seated obsession with the saturation of irony in culture and his corresponding production of a very detached and nihilistic cynicism, of which he is very much opposed. And two, he notes the tendency that writers might have to write with the sole objective of generating likability from the reader, which would, at least in his estimation, require pandering to some of their cynical impulses, which only further reproduces this culture of cynicism that Wallace critiques. As an example of what he's talking about, he references Bret Easton Ellis by name. He says, quote, "You can see this clearly in something like Ellis's American Psycho. It panders shamelessly to the audience's sadism for a while, but by the end it's clear that the sadism's real object is the reader herself." Still speaking on American Psycho, he also says, quote, "Look, man, we'd probably most of us agree that these are dark times and stupid ones, but do we need fiction that does nothing but dramatize how dark and stupid everything is? In dark times, the definition of good art would seem to be art that locates and applies CPR to those elements of what's human and magical that still live and glow despite the time's darkness. You can defend American Psycho as being a sort of performative digest of late 80s social problems, but it's no more than that." In 1993, when David Foster Wallace was saying these things about Bret Easton Ellis didn't have much to say. That changed in September 2012, which was 4 years after the passing of David Foster Wallace. So Bret Easton Ellis is staying up late one night, drinking some tequila, and reading the then recently published biography of David Foster Wallace entitled Every Love Story is a Ghost Story by D.T. Max. Likely emboldened by some liquid courage, Bret Easton Ellis took to Twitter to say that David Foster Wallace was, quote, "the best example of a contemporary male writer lusting for a kind of awful greatness that he simply wasn't able to achieve. A fraud." He goes on. He calls David Foster Wallace, quote, "the most tedious, overrated, tortured, pretentious writer of my generation." And it also seems like Bret Easton Ellis is very aware of the comments that David Foster Wallace had previously made, because in the same Twitter rant, he said that Wallace, quote, "was so needy, so conservative, so in need of fans, that I find the halo of sentimentality surrounding him embarrassing." So notice, we have Bret Easton Ellis critiquing David Foster Wallace for precisely the same reason that David Foster Wallace had critiqued Bret Easton Ellis, which is this issue of likability. Each of them saying that the other is pandering to an audience. In an interview in 2013, Bret Easton Ellis is asked to remark upon those tweets, and he writes, quote, "I was not surprised by the backlash to those tweets. There are a lot of little snowflakes who somehow really respond to this faux earnestness of David Foster Wallace that I just don't think is realistic." But it's not over. 3 years later, in 2015, after the release of The End of the Tour, which is a biopic about David Foster Wallace, Bret Easton Ellis again took to Twitter, calling David Foster Wallace Saint David and critiquing the film as, quote, "reverential to a fault. Nothing more than an act of hero worship and, quote, Every line of dialogue in this very moist movie exists to reinforce Wallace's likability. Now, this literary beef raises a lot of interesting questions. Among them, this relationship between likability, cynicism, and authenticity on the part of the writer, but also this perennial question of who do you got in this beef? Are you on the side of David Foster Wallace, Bret Easton Ellis, or are you sitting this one out?